was requested to make a video all about this book, Football in the Land of the Soviets, and as a man of the people, I will be doing exactly that. However, at the end of this video, I will be talking about some other political sports books, more specifically football, but I'll try and throw in some other ones in there as well, so stick until the end for that. But let's get right into it. Football in the Land of the Soviets by Carl Viñas is a book all about the establishment of football in the Russian Empire and the early Soviet Union. So it doesn't actually cover the entire history of Soviet Union football because the Soviet Union was pretty dominant, particularly in the defensive positions, which actually it goes into in the book. We'll talk about that towards the end of the video. But it talks about how football came to Russia and the Russian Empire, and how the Bolsheviks used football actually as a way to promote not just physical fitness, but also unity, and also the kind of the split in that. It's a quite interesting book, to be honest. It sounds like it could be a bit dry, especially if you're someone who's more so into sports than football, sports than politics, but still, it's quite a interesting read. Viñas uses Tolstoy's three-book analogy of childhood, boyhood and youth to describe the development of football in the late Russian Empire into the Soviet Union, and so that's kind of the three parts that this book is split into. Childhood is about the initial establishment of football in the Russian Empire, how football was brought over, particularly by British traders who, after the end of the Crimean War, they were kind of like, oh yeah, we got no money, guys, let's bring in the British traders. The Russian Empire, however much people who hate the Soviet Union tell you was good, it was evil, it was bad. The majority of the people were suffering. They actively were suppressing any workers' rights movements violently. We'll get into that more in terms of football as well. But the late Russian Empire was a hellhole for the working class, for the people. Sounds very familiar right now to kind of the world we're living in, right? But the British traders were invited in because Russia was like, we've got no money, we've got no industry, we need to industrialize. They brought the British in, and from, Germany, France, elsewhere, but particularly the British in this kind of idea of football. And then when the workers and the tradesmen came, they decided, okay, we're gonna, continue our British tradition of playing football. Eventually, actual Russians got involved. So they established teams, but they were mostly workers who were from England, France, Germany. Again, mostly England and the rest of the UK. And then eventually Russians were like, oh yeah, we want to take part in that. In this part of the history of Russian football, it was very much a divide between the teams that were started by the Russian workers and the foreigners who came in. So, and then, football was concentrated mostly in the main cities and population hubs of St. Petersburg and Moscow. We'll get more into that in the second part of the book. But basically, Viñas talks about how football initially was seen as a good thing in terms of physical fitness to help get the workers, physically active. But like I alluded to earlier, the Russian Empire was like, why are all of these young working class men gathering together? Are they planning on overthrowing us? And so the police very brutally cracked down on a lot of the Russian, mostly clubs, the native clubs we'll refer to them as. However, by the time it came to the Russo-Japanese War, when the Japanese trounced the Russians, they were like, hey, we need to actually start improving the physical fitness of the soldiers that we conscript. So, all the men in Russia. And so they started to be like, hey, this football thing sounds good. You guys can start organizing, tournaments and games and having teams. And like I said again earlier, the majority of the powerhouses of teams came from St. Petersburg and Moscow, and you kind of had two different philosophies of football, the Muscovite one and the St. Petersburg philosophy. And around this time is when they started thinking about doing international games, and it was dominated by those two industries. However, as time went on, other parts of the then Russian Empire, there were parts that were more towards the east where players started to develop kind of like modern day Azerbaijan, if you would, and Armenia and all that area. They started getting more players through there. That takes us on to the next part of the book, which was boyhood, which is where we're approaching the end of the Russian Empire. However, football in Russia was becoming more and more professionalized. Football terms, amateur and professional, it's kind of different to how, you know, a lay person would kind of use that, but you know, you start having more formal clubs, more formal leagues. You had a national cup, a national tournament, but still leagues were played in more of a city or state-wide way of playing. If you know like South American football, particularly like Argentinian or Brazilian, there's more so a focus on your state championship, your more local championship for most of the season. That's kind of how it was in Russia at the time. But as we're approaching the end of the kind of Russian Empire, you started seeing other groups starting to adopt football, and you saw Lenin and other Bolsheviks be like, oh, things like football is good for helping keep up the physical fitness of the Bolsheviks, or at least the Red Army, and also it would be a good thing for promoting cohesion and learning together. There were people who weren't a fan. Trotsky didn't like it. But Lenin was like, sports, good, we'll keep it up. And so we eventually have the Bolshevik Revolution. Viñas does also, you know, talk about how the Bolshevik Revolution impacted football, and the Civil War impacted football, you know. So he does go into that, but talking more about the football, we then quickly go on to actually the Soviet Union establishing the footballing leagues. So at this point, there were two camps of ideology. The hygienists kind of saw sports more as, you know, sports as a way for people to come together and play games, whereas the second group, the proto-occultists, again, sorry, I don't speak Russian, saw it more as a way to kind of demonstrate Soviet physical prowess and use it as a way to continue the Soviet, you know, line of showing it as togetherness, as the power of the workers, and move it away from the, what they perceived to be more bourgeois elements, which was the competition, the winning, the individuality of the teams, instead of it being for the entire of the Soviet Union. Eventually, you know, the Bolsheviks came to kind of a middle ground between the two, where football was still used as a way to promote Soviet prowess, and also the ideology of the way football was played was more about the togetherness, the Soviets working together, and you know, promoting this pro-revolutionary ideology through sports. However, you know, there was still that thing of like, hey, we're going to have the competitions to kind of help them get better, to face each other, so then we can also help create a Soviet Union team which can go out and show the power of the Soviet Union to the rest of the world. You know, countries still do that. Sports are still used heavily as a way to promote their own ideologies, like the United States. You know, they keep trying to be like, we are so good at football. I mean, they use the women's football team as just propaganda. Like, look how great we are. This is because they're American. They're so strong because they're American. They're hoping to do that with the men's team. Like Donald Trump right now is probably hoping and praying and probably bribing to try and get the United States as far, if not win, the World Cup. They won't. They're not good enough in every metric. I won't get into that. That's the other part of my work life. But yeah, the Soviets decided they were going to do that as well. And then the book ends kind of talking about how generally how the Soviet Union performed in terms of football, and kind of how the Soviet ideology still went through football in the Soviet Union throughout its time, particularly talking about how good the goalkeeping was in the Soviet Union. Lev Yashin was the only goalkeeper to win the Ballon d'Or, which was best European footballer in the world at that point. And because the Soviets put such focus on the goalkeeper as kind of the heart of your team's defense, he is basically the representation of the Soviet Union holding back the reactionary forces, which is the other team. He is, you know, the Soviet Union in goal, you know, defending the motherland, if you will. So it's a really interesting book. You know, if you're more looking for football stats and figures and the performance of the Soviet Union, it might not be for you. But, you know, there's also chapters about how the foreign countries and the whites tried to spy on the Bolsheviks through football, basically sending guys over there, and then they got into football teams that were, you know, pro-whites, and then they were trying to use that to infiltrate into the Bolsheviks and their footballing ranks. So it's pretty interesting. You know, there's a lot of stuff you don't really know about. I did feel like there was a lot, like, I think over half of the book, about half of the book is mostly about the Russian Empire and less about the Soviet Union. But again, the book only covers up until the mid to late 30s, so it doesn't go further into Soviet Union. Obviously, at that point, then the Second World War starts. So I would maybe have liked a little bit more afterwards, but this was more so about the establishment of the Soviet Union, the establishment of football in the Soviet Union and the end of it, and how it kind of came into formerly the Russian Empire. So that was Football in the Land of the Soviets. I'll put a link to it down below if you are interested. Very quick fire, I want to talk about two other books. One is The Roaring Red Front. This book is all about left-wing football clubs. There are some, however, I would say still are pro-imperialism. So like St. Pauli is the one where everyone talks about being this like strong left-wing German football club. However, they are a German team, so they do still adhere to kind of pro-German imperialist ideas like the existence of Israel and support for Israel, or, you know, they start talking about, the book talks about teams like Celtic in Scotland. So it's pretty interesting. Palestino in Chile, which was a club that was formed by Palestinian refugees who lived in Chile, and I follow them. They're great. I think you see a lot of people wearing the Palestino t-shirt because it is based on the Palestinian flag. So it's an interesting enough read, but I would temper your expectation with that. And then also I just say CLR James's Beyond the Boundary, which is about cricket, but also about kind of Caribbean left-wing politics and his experience in the left wing when he came to study in England. So thank you for watching. I want to give a special shout out to my members. Members get access to the book club, the movie club. They get videos early. They get other videos. You can join from as little as £1 a month by hitting that join button down below or on my channel. Thank you for watching. Like, subscribe, share the video with a friend or family member. And hey, I hope you read a great book today. Of course Trotsky didn't like football. Of course he didn't like football.